Thanks, Mark. We've got now Craig McMurray. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Res Publica.
If we had sound. Okay, the purpose of that video was not an advertorial for, I think it was Eastwood Village, but really to kind of demonstrate that I think we had 3 different videos that were made, and that was my last pick of all 3 videos. By my estimation, it's a pretty crappy video. You've got this scratching your fingers on the chalkboard stuff, but the bottom line is our clientele is millennials. It's not a real estate business. It's not how we perceive real estate and property to be. It's really what the youth market and the student market want. And we put all of our videos to focus groups, and at the end of the day, the one that we, as the owners and managers of this last thought would be popular was that video. A bit about Res Publica. It's all up there, but we've been in existence now for close on 10 years. And in that time, we've grown from a startup in 2010 with 300 beds. And in January, we'll be letting and taking in approximately 10,000 students across our portfolio in South Africa. A few years ago, we brought on an institutional investor, being Redefined Properties, as our partner in the business. And that's assisted and helped us to really push the boat out in terms of our growth and what our plans are for the brand, both here in South Africa and outside the country as well. That's just an idea of how we've grown over the last couple of years. And in terms of what we're targeting, we're expecting that within the next 3 to 4 years, we hope that we'd reach about the 20,000 bed mark based on the growth trajectory and the target markets we've identified. At the moment, we service most of the main universities in South Africa. We started off predominantly in Gauteng, and we've now spread the brand across the country as a true national brand. And we service predominantly the public universities in this country, as well now as some of the growing private universities. That gives you an idea of the facilities that we manage and the extent of our operations. And you will soon hear that this is not a real estate business. It's not about the bed and the facilities. It's really about all the add-on amenities that students seriously desire. But at the end of the day, you've all heard about student accommodation, and I think a lot of myths and rumors out there make it a very sexy industry to be in, but the realities need to be well understood because it is quite different. So definitely in this country, and I think in some other markets where it's far more mature, it's regarded as a sure bet. When your hairdresser starts telling you if you're in property, you must be in student accommodation, you know it's a bit like Bitcoin and the horse is probably bolted. So what isn't student accommodation? Well, first of all, it's not conventional real estate. It behaves very differently, and what it requires is totally different to any of the main asset class types that you're used to. At the same time, it's not residential accommodation, and it's not HMOs as it's commonly referred to in the market overseas, or digs as we would understand it. It's not the hotel business, the traditional hotel business, or serviced apartments. And nor is it dormitory style living with lots of people crammed into small places with limited amenities. The other issue is that you constantly hear about the shortage in student accommodation. And the reality is that there's a shortage of certain product types, but the reality is everyone is sleeping somewhere. It might not be the best and most conducive for study and for students, but the reality is that everyone is actually staying somewhere. So your market and your competition is any form of accommodation. So what is it really? Well, firstly, it's a very bespoke product. So it has a limited market, and one has to understand exactly what that market is. The product itself, if you build purpose-built student accommodation as to simply residential accommodation, is very bespoke. You can't reverse it out typically for any other use other than what it has been designed and built for. Secondly, it's exceptionally operationally intensive compared to any other property type. But at the same time, although it's not hotel, the hospitality standards are a prerequisite and what students expect. It is not about the bed. It's all about the amenities and the other lifestyle experiences and sense of community that one brings to the environment for students. It's a very segmented market, which means that you have different requirements that students have in terms of the level of privacy, their level of affordability, and what type of amenities that they're looking for. And affordability is a key theme which we'll speak to later. One can't expect that you're going to typically go on any type of long-term leases that are highly financeable. So you have to be prepared to be in a game where granular short-term lease are the order of the day. And with that comes very intensive rental collection operations. And more importantly, very location sensitive. Because at the end of the day, your campus is in a location, which means that that's where the student wants to be. There are very few alternatives, so you need to be in the right location. And that can take on different forms. Being in the right location doesn't always mean right on campus, because students do have a life outside of campus, and that has to be well understood as well. So where's the product actually evolved from? Well, in the very early days of universities anywhere in the world, you had your typical residence halls, which were dorms, and often they were sharing and remain sharing, but they had a very low level of amenities that went with them. The DIGSs or HMOs have been in existence forever, and I do believe that they will always have a place. And then from the late 90s and early 2000s, the actual bespoke product of PBSA came into existence. And I believe that it's the quality of the product and the extent to which that as an offering was being sought from students that attracted institutional investors, and now over the last 15 to 20 years has matured and allowed institutional investors to recognize it as a credible asset class. If you have a look where the markets sit, the USA was the first mover in the market, and they really came into their own in the late 90s and early 2000s. South Africa sits substantially behind in terms of the level of maturity in the market. And we talk about level of maturity in terms of the extent to which the product is actually recognized by the end user, being students and all the other stakeholders, universities, parents, and bursars, as well as the extent to which your institutional capital and capital markets are actually prepared to fund it. So you would have seen a lot of activity, in fact, in mainland Europe, the UK, as well as the US, almost, I think, for the last 3 years. It's been the single most attractive real estate asset class. And you've seen the evolution of the type of capital that chases PBSA. And right now, you're seeing a lot of activity amongst the pension funds. Recently, a lot coming out of Canada, Singapore, and the like. So to go back to what the product's about, students are very demanding, and it doesn't differentiate whether you are in a high-end developed market with students with a high level of affordability, such as the US or the UK and London, or whether you're sitting in South Africa or anywhere else in Africa. They're very discerning, and they have an aspiration for a lifestyle which comes with all the bells and whistles. The number one priority at the end of the day is Wi-Fi. You can switch off water, you can switch off lights, but I can promise you, if you want a riot and a protest, switch off the Wi-Fi. It really is the way that they operate socially. It's the way that they operate in the way that they learn and their education. And at the same time, it's actually the way that we operate in terms of how we manage our facilities. So it's become an integral part of what's on offer and how we build and how we run our facilities, to the extent that it dictates our collections environment and everything from sales, marketing, right through to facilities management, customer satisfaction, and collection ultimately is working off some type of a Wi-Fi network, and data plays an integral part of that. From the early days to today, we spend a substantial amount as a percentage of our overall development costs on the Wi-Fi infrastructure and reticulation that goes into any of our facilities. We were the first in South Africa to introduce uncapped, unlimited free Wi-Fi, and you will see that that will ultimately become the norm in the industry. So if we can talk about what we've learned along the way, and we definitely don't know it all, and we continue to learn things every day, even 8, 9 years later. I think right now everyone acknowledges that there's a shortage, and they do believe that if you simply build, that the students will come. But at the end of the day, in South Africa, and I think on the continent as a whole, affordability is the key issue. If students cannot afford the rental, no matter what the perceived shortage is, your facility will remain empty. We've seen it ourselves. Rental sensitivity is a massive issue. There's always an alternative, even if that alternative is sleeping under a bridge. If you cannot afford the accommodation, you simply won't come. One has to really understand the demographics, the socio-economic demographics of the type of students that attend a university campus. We have certain university clients that might have 3 campuses in a city, and each campus is treated entirely differently. Depending on the faculties that are there and where those students come from and what their level of affordability is, will dictate the type of product that we actually put on offer and what our rentals are. If we get that wrong, we will face massive vacancies. Across South Africa and many of the other underdeveloped countries and the continent as a whole, Tier 1, which is our sort of lowest level of affordability product, is where the biggest supply-demand imbalance sits. And that's really the challenge, because in order to get a feasible development off the ground that's financeable, it's really difficult at the type of rental rates that are expected from the market. You are competing with a lot of informal housing in our markets. You're also dealing with very low rental rates, which are prevalent at public university, where the true cost of replacement in terms of replacing that infrastructure is not well understood, and often it's subsidized. So when you come on with private equity capital at market-related building costs on a fully serviced basis, the rentals that are required to make that investment wash its face are substantially higher than what public university rental rates are, or the informal housing market is. In South Africa, although I believe there's certain nodal oversupplies in certain area, the product offering as a whole is still not well understood, because it's all about what the all-inclusive offering is. This is not about selling a bed. And only once the market actually understands what the student is getting in terms of the benefits of residing in a facility and all of the amenities, the lifestyle, and all the other add-ons that come with it, will one really be able to understand and be able to do a proper price comparison between what is offered in PBSA versus what is offered in other types of residential accommodation. Also, our markets that are less developed typically have a low concentration of international students, which means you're catering to the domestic market. And the domestic market typically is less mobile and has low levels of affordability than the international student market. So your markets like the UK, cities like London, markets like Australia, where it's Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and many of the other European countries have got many universities which sit within the top 100. They attract a high proportion of very mobile and affluent international students who are prepared, A, to pay more, have the ability to pay more, and also because they're international students, they're looking for that sense of community and convenience that the PBSA product offers. We don't have that in our market. Therefore, our business model, what we offer and how we operate it, has got to be geared towards lower rentals and generally student clientele that have low levels of affordability. In South Africa, we've been fortunate recently to experience some fairly interesting dynamics in our tertiary education space. And I say fortunate because some of it's been fairly scary with student protests, as well as our ex-president inviting all and sundry to pitch up for free education, despite the fact that the Department of Higher Education, the General Treasury, might be lacking the means. But that has brought on an element of liquidity. Now, the extent to which government can fund free education will work for us. The extent to which it's not sustainable and the administration and distribution of funds collapses will obviously count against us. But in the right scenario, it can work. And the extent to which in other countries in Africa that may prevail would be an interesting one to follow. In addition to the state entities and the Department of Higher Education and Treasury, individual universities, and the way that they administer and run things have an impact, because if you are reliant on state funding, often the state and the Department of Higher Education and Training will rely on the university to accredit private providers, and that can come with policy that sometimes is not entirely rational, and there can also be vested interests that try and prohibit the private operators from getting a chunk of the business. On the development side, it's not typically an industry where you can buy your way in very easily because it's undeveloped, which means that there are very few existing investment-grade assets out there that are available for acquiring, which means you've got to build. Building takes time, and there's a risk component involved. So to get into the game, one has to understand the environment and have an appetite to actually get into development and produce your own stock mainly. Location, as I said before, is absolutely critical. If you get the location wrong, it might work for a short while there's no competition around, but the moment some competition comes and they're in the preferred location, you will lose business very quickly. Secondly, there's no cookie cutter to developments. Across all of our facility, not one of them look the same because it's a function of the demographics at that university, which will dictate the product mix, and also a function of the land. Your urban locations, which are far more higher density, will give you a very different look and feel to your more rural universities where you've got the luxury of space. You have to have a lot of amenities. Mark spoke earlier in the service apartment space about the extent to which they have a lot of amenities in terms of what they offer for conferencing and everything else. And in our game, we firmly believe that in order to be competitive, again, you can't just be offering a bed. Students are there, and if you want retention and you want to bring those students back year after year and command the highest possible rental, you've got to be able to offer all the bells and whistles. So all of our facilities will come with gyms, computer centers, study centers. Many of them have canteens, and all of the recreational rooms, as well as outdoor facilities like basketball courts and soccer fields and the rest. It really is a prerequisite if you want to be competitive in the long term. Your ongoing maintenance and operating costs, you need to bear those into account before you build, when you design, because at the end of the day, it's pretty much a wet rate business. If you were hiring out yellow goods like a grader or a bulldozer on a construction site with diesel in, that's exactly what you're doing here. It's an all-inclusive rates. Students don't want add-ons. They can't afford add-ons. They don't like the risk of not knowing what they're in for. So you need to be able to have a facility that runs as efficiently as possible, and you need to be able to monitor those costs, because unlike an office block or a retail block where you simply have a see-through of charges for utilities, rates and taxes, water, electricity, you don't have that typically in the student game, and so you need to be able to manage those very tightly. And then timing of delivery. Unlike the hotel game, this is not something where if you bring a new facility on after the start of an academic year, you will battle to fill that facility, and you'll battle to move your occupancy rate from where it was at the start of the academic year, because those students will have made commitments to go elsewhere. It's fairly inflexible, especially where there's a shortage of student accommodation, which means that it's difficult for them to break the leases they may have entered into, and it comes at quite a cost. And because affordability is such a major issue, they won't be able to afford to break those leases. So if you have a 50% occupied building because you were late on completion and students only came belatedly, in our game, you need to be ready by the end of the year. If you're not ready by February, you can forget it. And you pretty much know exactly how your occupancies are going to look and how your managed accounts are going to look come December at the end of February. If you miss that window, then you've got a lot of problems for the rest of the year. So the delivery risk around the time frames and managing your works program very tightly are absolutely critical when you are developing and building out a portfolio. So just about what we build, again, it's not about the bed, it's about having facilities that are modern, and you don't have a transient short-term client or guest that's coming in like you do in the hotel game. These guys are with you 24/7. They are living student hours, which are not conventional living people hours. They gravitate in and out of that facility in all sorts of states at all times of the day, and you've got to be able to deal with that and service that and manage that student community in a harmonious way that works for everyone. Being aspirational, being millennials, they have a desire to be in facilities that are modern and that offer them all the bells and whistles. And Wi-Fi really is, again, a major component of the offering that you're going to be judged by. In terms of owning and what people's expectations and investors' expectations should be, I think, again, the myth is that this is a high-yield game. If affordability is a major issue, your rentals are going to be low, and your ops costs in student accommodation, they gravitate around the 40% mark. This is not a 10 to 20%, conventional commercial or retail or industrial property. It has a very high ops cost ratio, so it's very sensitive. We don't talk about ops costs in our business. We talk about absolute cost per bed. And the reason being is that if I've got a bed that's been leased for 3,000 Rand a month for a certain product versus another product that's selling at 8,000 Rand a month, my ops costs are fairly consistent. So my ratio is going to change hugely depending on the revenue that I'm charging for that product type. So when you look at performance in terms of the asset, you need high occupancies to be able to stomach the high ops cost ratios. But as an asset class and as a portfolio, it is a defensive play more than it is a high yield play, because it is not a high yielding. In South African terms, the myth that this will deliver you 12 to 15% initial yields really is not true. To get this over the line, to make feasibilities bankable versus any other asset class is very difficult. They compare quite closely in terms of initial yields on cost, but it's about its resilience. When the macroeconomic fundamentals are negative and you see your commercial real estate, you see retail and other property types falling back and paring back in terms of their performance, you'll see student accommodation remain stable. So really it is a defensive play that's quite agnostic about what's going on in the general environment, because students are studying. The enrollment numbers at universities, you've got to pay close attention to. I think it's more a case of what macro government policy might be in terms of education that drives it more than macroeconomic conditions. But it really is very resilient, and it's proven itself all over the world. And I think that is the attraction to investors if one was looking for a defensive play. We've spoken about rental affordability, and because of that, one has to have a very conservative view on the ability to escalate rentals when you're at the affordable end of the market. So, CPI is a good yardstick. There are very few nodes that you can go into where the general demographics of that campus are very high in terms of the levels of affordability of students, and you can push rental growth beyond what you see in the inflation environment. Operating costs we've spoken about, you've got to manage those very tightly because they're non-recoverable. So you almost see it like a revenue line more than ops cost. Every cent you save goes straight to the bottom line. High wear and tear. You can imagine any type of hospitality offering, let alone one that's with students on a 24/7 basis. What you put into your building, how you build it, your FF&E, and the quality of your FF&E is so important. And you need to provide sufficiently to replace that on a regular basis. Otherwise, your facility is going to age and your occupancy levels are going to drop and you're going to lose students. So you need to be providing, I think, substantially more than in any other property type. Yield expectations, again, I'll talk about that just now. It's not a high yield environment as some perceive it to be. And you're only as good as your last innings. So performance resets every year. And I know there's probably a lot of investors and people out there who think, well, you must have leases, long-term leases with universities. The reality is that those are like hen's teeth. If you really want to grow a scalable business, you need to be prepared to build at risk and direct let to the market, which means that every year you're resetting. In the case of Res Publica, we looked at how we could disrupt the market. Wi-Fi was one of them. Besides a built environment, which we believe is a far more superior product in terms of how modern it is and all the amenities, we found a couple of other structural deficiencies that were an impediment to students. One was the fact that they didn't have access to reliable Wi-Fi, or it was very costly. And the other issue was that they found the leases very inflexible, and often because of the lack of supply, were forced to go and stay in accommodation that wasn't suitable for them, and it was expensive to break. So we introduced the concept of 30 days notice. We only sign students up for 30 days. They can give us a month's notice, and they're entitled to walk if the service and the product doesn't live up to the expectation. And that was very different to what anyone else in the market was doing. We've seen some competitors take that on, but not a lot. And at the end of the day, it puts the right amount of incentive and pressure in our management team and our site staff to make sure that customer satisfaction is at the highest level, so that our students remain in the residence and come back year on year. And we monitor that obviously very closely on a daily basis and a monthly basis, and we're able to see, when standards start slipping, not at the end of the year when it's too late. In terms of management, you should not be in student accommodation unless you've got a hands-on management team that's got experience in this game. It's not like any other, and a lot of what goes into managing students does not relate to the building. It does not relate to real estate. It relates to all of the community management and student administration side of things. And if you want to be a long-term player with a healthy relationship with the university, they need to trust and understand what you deliver for their student body. Otherwise, you're not going to get the referrals, you're not going to get the accreditation, and you're not going to get the level of retention that you need to maintain high occupancy rates. At the same time, we do see a lot of competition coming into the market. I'm not sure it's all informed competition. There are a few credible competitors out there, but a lot of people in the last couple of years have dived into student accommodation, and I think you're going to see substantial consolidation in this year, next year, as the realities of student accommodation come home to roost. I think this just gives you a bit of an idea with regard to performance of the asset class. I haven't put South Africa in here for a very particular reason. That's because it's fairly undeveloped. So it really would be my thumb suck as to what's happening. But you will see a common trend there if you look at the developed markets. And that is that at the end of the day, residential pretty much everywhere trades at quite a premium to other property types. At the same time, the PBSA market is trading at a discount to pretty much all other property types. So if you're an investor or if you're a developer and you have expectations of what you should be expecting, it is a higher yielding game, but as you can see there, it's not a massively higher yielding game. If you look at the differential, for example, between PBSA in the UK and A-grade office in the UK, it's 50 basis points. So maybe a 8 to 10% premium or discount in this case for PBSA. As far as the asset quality is concerned, it's going to be very much a function of the university that it's servicing. So universities typically don't go anywhere, which means that your asset has to be in the right location, and you're going to be reliant on that university, its sustainability, its ability to keep growing its enrollments, and attract the right type of student who can afford your product. And so when you look at your location and what your long-term sustainability and returns are like, you really have to look very closely at the university that you're servicing. And then obviously your distance to campus. Transport can work in cities and in suburbs where you have very efficient public transport. They are few and far between. In South Africa, Cape Town's probably about the only place where the concentric that we gravitate, the radius that we move outside of a campus is the furthest, because it's got both a good university transport system as well as a good city transport system. Anywhere else, we can't rely on it, which means we've got to be on the campus. And that obviously restricts the ability to find assets or land to develop in the right location. With a low margin on affordable rentals, transport kills this business. We've got very few examples in our portfolio where we do have transport, and typically those were our assets in the very early days that we got in on higher yields, which don't exist nowadays, and we're able to stomach the transport costs purely because of our legacy carrying costs of those assets. And then obviously the age of the facility, the standard of the facility in terms of how modern it is and how well it's been maintained, and the technology that's in there. Because it is a wet rate, all-inclusive offering, you've got to employ a lot of technology into the building itself to make sure you can manage those costs. So we have circuits that will cut off certain usages. Heaters will only work for a certain time of the year. We install our own heaters. They may not bring their own heaters in. They're energy efficient, and between certain types of year, those are disabled. Stoves that can be used as heaters and can be left on accidentally. Our stoves all are on circuits. Those circuits have timers on, regardless of whether you're cooking a 3-hour slow cook stew, it will switch off after 30 minutes, and you will need to re-engage that. These are the type of things that you need to do to save energy, as well as to ensure that there's a level of safety in terms of how those tenants are behaving in their facilities. And then, I think the important part is that the amenities you offer, again, it needs to be all-inclusive if you want to compete with core prime rated facilities. If you don't have all the amenities, it is going to affect the asset quality and the rating of the asset. So to go on to operations, as I said before, really it is a very complex management business that requires one to coordinate a bunch of disciplines within the business. And if you don't have that capability and that platform, it is going to be rather difficult to grow any type of a business of scale. Your student administration, in terms of how you intake students and vacate them and how you deal with them on a daily basis, both them as well as the universities who play an active role, is really intensive. Student support and well-being is a huge part of what needs to be managed on a daily basis. And then the facility management side of things, as I was talking about earlier. ResLife programs and student community. If we talk about ResPublic as a brand, it's our key differentiator. Our ResLife programs are proper ResLife programs that focus on delivering co-curricular activities for the students that encompass both student well-being, mentoring, educational support, right through to sports programs and participation in our own leagues as well as the universities' leagues, right through to the social eventing and community programs that we run. And that's really what students are subscribing for when they decide that they want to come and stay in your residence. They can get a bed anywhere, but are they going to get that sense of community and all the amenities that go with it and that lifestyle for their duration while they're there? Marketing and sales obviously is a massive issue. From our point of view, we'll be selling 10,000 beds in January of this year, and you need to understand how that environment works when that market wakes up and decides it actually wants to acquire, and when it switches off and decides I've made that decision. It is a very seasonal business. It's not something that is on all year. There's a window, and you've got to take advantage of that window. Obviously, where one has got head lease arrangements, that marketing and sales takes on a different life. And you look at the different channels and stakeholders that are involved in that. Intake and vacate is crucial in the business. To give you an idea, of those 10,000 students, we will take probably 9,000 in the space of 3 to 4 weeks. And most of those will arrive at the door with a bag. This is not students who book the year before and make a choice and pay their deposit and pay their rental in advance. This student, as a domestic market, both here as well as other markets that we've investigated overseas, they pretty much arrive on the doorstep, and you have to have the controls, the standard operating procedures, the trained staff, and the systems to be able to handle that, which means that you are reserving, booking, invoicing that volume of people in that short space of time across multiple sites on a national basis. And without the right infrastructure, it becomes very difficult. Obviously, on a single asset basis, it's a different story, but still, you will have a rush hour that is very short if you haven't marketed at the right time of the year, and if you haven't staffed yourself up to deal with it at that intake period, it can create a lot of problems. And because of that granular nature, obviously collections is a major issue. In our game, we've probably got, and I stand under correction, but anywhere between 12 to 14 different payment channels that we rely on every single month to get our rental. And they all behave very differently. It's from hand-holding, it's from debt counseling, it's from sitting with governmental agencies, sitting with universities, sitting with corporate bursars. It involves the full spectrum, and you've got to be able to understand those, and they are different at every university. Even in this country, if we talk about NSFAS funding and payment mechanisms at the University of Johannesburg is totally different to Tshwane University of Technology. So you need to have the engine to be able to deal with this, manage those risks, and effectively collect. And behind that sits a system. Without a system to operate this, we'd be dead in the water with the scale of our business. To go back to what our DNA is, which I spoke about before, it's really all about that co-curricular lifestyle offering. And that's what differentiates us to anyone in our market, as well as the fact that everything we do is an all-inclusive offering. So students know they pay a fixed rate and they get everything. The only thing that a student is liable for is his own food as well as his own linen. Everything else is covered by Res Publica. These two slides, which I'll show you, this and the next slide, is just to give you an idea of what happens on a daily basis and how we're engaging with our students. And it's all about, again, the lifestyle offering. You have to have a program and a team to actually deliver it. Think of it as eventing. We have to be able to deliver this experience to students on a daily basis. To give you an example, now that we have a portfolio that's got scale, we are able to actually hold our own sports leagues around amongst our 10 residences. So although we will integrate through cooperation with the universities all of our residents' teams into the University Sports League, in addition, we actually have our own Res Publica sports league that operates throughout the year. So in terms of the value chain, I'm just going to refer to the three main disciplines and quickly take you through that. But property development I spoke about earlier. Obviously, the asset management side of the business has been crucial in terms of the way that we raise capital, the way that we do portfolio management, and then through to our operations, which really is the very intensive part. In order for us to integrate all of these issues, we have to have a very efficient system that is able to see what each of the other components of the business are doing. So the components that are highlighted in yellow there are really the niche, very specialist components that I think differ to any other typical components in real estate. And that is where our core capabilities as Res Publica have really been developed over the last 8 to 10 years. The other components, whether it's housekeeping or security, those type of facility aspects, repairs and maintenance, right through to procurement, project development management, those skills exist in the industry. The other aspects around our leasing administration, collections, res life, and the asset management part, which really means understanding what student accommodation is about and how it performs as an asset class, only come with experience. They are not typical to the real estate game. So at Res Publica, we deployed a few of the off-the-shelf products that were around, mainly coming out of the States, with some of the bigger funds that had been using them over there, as well as the UK. And we very soon found that our requirements and the requirements of our tenant base were quite different, and we didn't think that the systems really were assisting us as much as what we needed. And our business model as well required a lot more than what was readily available off the shelf. So we began developing our own system 4 years ago, and that really has become the backbone of what and how Res Publica operates. To the extent that we are now white labeling this as high res, and we're selling it into the international markets. We're quite proud of the fact that we were pitted against those same big names that we used to use in Australia recently, and won contracts to manage facilities in Australia based on the functionality of our system. If you look at on your side, the right-hand side graph, when we talk about our sales and marketing, we are monitoring on a daily basis through some algorithms, the same way you heard Mark talk about how they dynamically price. We don't dynamically price, but we have to know what's coming in at the top of the sausage machine to understand where we're going to sit come February in terms of our occupancy levels. And that has to be monitored on a daily basis at a residence. Different residences in different regions will behave differently. And if you don't have the systems to be able to monitor that, you can find yourself very short come February. And as I say, there's no ability to catch up. Once the start of the academic year is commenced, it is very difficult to move your occupancy levels from there. I was asked to talk about on and off campus student accommodation solutions. Obviously, we can really only with confidence talk about the private off-campus market, but we've been exposed to stuff on campus. We have participated with many RFPs that have been put out in South Africa, and we've been asked to come on board as technical advisors for some projects that have been put out in the SADC. But the bottom line is that there is a shortage. Generally, across the board, there's a provision rate of on-campus accommodation that equates to less than 10% of the student population. And that on-campus stuff that is out there really is of poor quality, and it's not a product that the students willingly typically want to actually reside in. So the demand has been met up by the sectors that I spoke about before, the informal sectors, and even the large-scale PBSA offerings that have been brought on board. A lot of them are what I would call sub-investment grade. So there is a strong demand out there, but the demand is of a product that is generally of a far higher quality than what is around, and it is one that requires a level of affordability, unfortunately. Debt and development finance for investment properties and or for new development projects, it's very difficult to be able to raise that type of finance if there isn't an understanding and appreciation of what is on offer, and if there isn't confidence in the ability of the developer to actually, at the end of the day, operate, that he's got the right product for that market and that he's able to operate. So we faced these challenges many years ago, and we were fortunate that some of our local banks took a punt on us, and our first projects were really successful, and the brand built itself on their way. Nowadays, when we go to the markets, we raise capital on a very competitive basis relative to any of the other real estate players out there, and there really isn't any differentiation, although it is a far higher risk game, I believe, than some of the more traditional property types, if you don't have the right operator and developer on board. I do believe that in many of these markets, it's a direct let market. In other words, you can't be reliant on getting leases, which is more risky, but at the same time, there is a flip side where you can shake some of the shackles that come with being beholden to state entities and reliant on an environment that you don't have a lot of control over. So the opportunities that sit out there, I think simply to be a developer and not to be an operator or have a credible operator on board will be a limitation. So the opportunity is to get that mix right in order to raise the right capital. And then working university relationships, regardless of whether you have a formal head lease or not, those university relationships are crucial. So the opportunity really is to build those, and they take on various forms of commitment, from long-term head leases, which, as I say, I think are few and far between, right through to different type of nomination agreements and concessions and accreditation, which ultimately give you a flow of students, not always mitigating the credit risk, but at least giving you a flow of students that get your occupancy level up. The collections and operations really then sits in your hands. Tax incentives are imperative. We don't really have a lot in South Africa. The Section 12J is one that has got traction. In our case, we have one of our listed funds, as I said earlier, Redefine, as a partner. So we haven't had to go to other sources in the market, in the capital markets. But there are a few incentives in South Africa, and I think the more extent to which those incentives are provided, the more liquidity you'll see, and the more you'll see the private sector coming into the market. Operational credibility we've spoken about before, and balance sheet. And I think if you have a balance sheet, if you've got a track record of developing, and you can pair that with the other requirements around operational credibility, then it's obviously going to stand you in good stead. And then access to property opportunities. The whole start of the industry was go and find old obsolete buildings, be they office buildings or whatever it might be, and convert them. The reality is that if you want to grow a business and you're relying on finding the right building that's conducive for conversion, because they aren't all conducive, that's available for sale at the right price, in the right location, it's needle in the haystack stuff. So it's going to be difficult for you to grow a meaningful business. There's opportunistic transactions you can do
where they might present themselves, but in our case, it's how we started out, and we found that it was the biggest impediment to really growing aggressively, and so we moved on to new builds, which meant that we focused more on trying to find the right pieces of land in the right locations. In terms of the on-campus market, we've spoken about the low level of provision and the poor quality of existing stock. Typically, you'll have two types of universities. You'll have those that are in urban areas that might have a strong balance sheet, but they've got limited land. Or you'll find the opposite. You'll find rural universities that might have poor balance sheets, but they have an abundance of hard land. And that's really the dynamic that one typically finds. I think in terms of what it provides universities, we've seen all the public universities in South Africa all own and operate their own residences, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. They are quite protective of it, and they see it as a critical part of the infrastructure they're offering to students. You did see in the States and in the UK a lot of universities understanding that their core capabilities was around research and around providing education, and that they weren't specialists in terms of real estate and in terms of operating and managing student accommodation. And so many of them divested out of it to the private sector that was focused on delivering the product. And I believe a lot of them were success. And we're talking about all the Ivy League universities that have gone down this route. It is an opportunity, but it's only an opportunity to the extent that the public universities have got their heads in that space, where they actually are not threatened, and they see this as a way of both relieving the burden on their balance sheet, as well as improving the profitability of their income statement. Because typically, they are running these residences at a loss. And they're running them at a loss because they're not specialists in facilities management, and secondly, those buildings are outdated, the technology that's in there is outdated, and they don't have the necessary skills typically to manage them. So, I think the challenges to partner on campus need to circumnavigate a bunch of political issues, administration issues that exist definitely in our environment, and I can't talk for other environments, but they definitely exist now. And at the same time, the student accommodation industry has to take responsibility, because there are certain legacy issues where university did, with very good faith, try and enter into arrangements with operators that were stumped. And they were very biased towards the developers, and those have come back to bite them, and so there is a reluctance based on those poor experiences. The solutions, I don't think that they're rocket science and one has to recreate the wheel. And the reality is that there are a lot of PPP structures that have been in existence for a long time that could work in this space. They've been tested, but we've seen very few examples of where they've actually been executed on. Some have, and with lesser degrees, and in certain cases, certain degrees of success. Sale and leaseback has worked well in the US and in the UK. Long-term lease agreements, I've seen them work, and I think that would be a major advantage, where the university doesn't have to divest of its assets, but simply put them out to the long-term lease spaces, let the private sector come in and recapitalize them and extract their return over the life of that long-term lease. And it's available for the university to take back after that period. And then the ability of the private sector coming in to really improve the university's balance sheets and income statement goes a long way to delivering on the social imperative. If you look at the requirement for the universities in South Africa to provide education to a very large and increasing student pool that now are dependent and expectant of getting state funding, it's putting increasing pressure on them. And if they could really relieve themselves of the burden of these residences that don't perform for them, it would go a long way to making them far more sustainable in the long term. Okay, that's it. If there are any questions, thanks.
So, I'm in the retail property industry, and your 30-day break clause makes me quite nervous. How do you mitigate your risk, especially because I think there's quite a high drop-off rate, particularly for first-year students. How do you deal with that risk mitigation, and also how do you deal with the holiday period, December, end of November, December, January?
Sure.
How do you, because obviously there's no income then during those periods.
aside from praying a lot, we back the brand to fill that bed when it becomes empty. It is definitely a risk, but again, it's a risk we decided to take to be competitive in the market. To go to the holiday short stay, we discount 2 months of the year as vacant. So when we look at whatever our monthly rental is, in order to annualize it, times it by 10, don't times it by 12. And the feasibility of the business model has got to stack up on that type of a rental. You typically can sweat a bit of ancillary income, but only if you are in a coastal location like Cape Town, where there's a bit of a holiday market. To try and do that in Gauteng or to do it in Nelspruit or Pretoria, it's really not going to be meaningful in terms of the bottom line. So it needs to stack up on a 10-month basis. In terms of the 30 days, we face occupancy, vacancy risks and bad debts, but it's all about your collections engine. And if you've got a high retention rate and you bring students back year and year, you know what that student behavior is. So typically in the international markets, they regard anything above 20% as a high retention rate. In our market, we target a 60% retention rate first years to second years. And you know the behavior of that tenant. So you have already mitigated an element of that by having a high degree of retention because you know how that student behaves. But it is not without risk. It definitely does expose us to more risk, but one that we expect the brand to deliver on.
Hi, Craig. I just wanted to know what kind of percentage do you allow for FF&E?
Are you asking as a sort of depreciation charge or as a build cost?
As a build cost.
As a build cost, it will vary depending on the product type. So we offer about 16 different product types and they have different FF&E charges. So from double non-ensuite rooms that share communal bathrooms and kitchens, right through to full ensuite studios that have their own kitchens and bathrooms. And they'll have a different ratio of FF&E. I'd say in terms of depreciation and what one needs to reserve in order to account for refurbing and replacement, it's way higher. It's anywhere around 1.5% a year, depending on the nature of the facility. But again, if your technology is wrong, if your repairs and maintenance are wrong, that can be a lot higher. But that's what we typically reserve.
Greg, you spoke about nodes where there's high saturation. Which nodes are those? And
so I think Balwani Damiso is one of our colleagues in the industry with a very large portfolio, so he's quite familiar with this guy. But I think we've found Pretoria to be pretty oversupplied at the moment. And again, one has to look at what tier of the market's oversupplied. So I don't believe that tier 1's oversupplied anywhere. I think there's a massive demand for affordable product. The tier 3, what we call sort of the equivalent of a 4 or 5-star hotel offering, is definitely oversupplied in many nodes. And Pretoria is the one where I see it most aggressively oversupplied. So what you're seeing there is landlords having to aggressively cut their rates in order to be competitive. And when you cut your rates, the entire economics changes totally because, as you know, your ops costs are pretty much fixed. So if you're expecting an 8,000 Rand a month rental and you're chopping that down to 5.5, 6 grand, but you're sitting on an ops cost ratio that's around about 40% at that type of rental rate, then you can see how the returns are compressed very quickly.
How do you deal with the maintenance issue throughout the year?
So it was a question, how do I deal with maintenance issues throughout the year? We run a maintenance prevention program, which means we don't concentrate our maintenance in the downtime at the end of the year when it's vacant. If you want to have satisfied students, you need to be maintaining all year round. And if you want to make sure that those initial maintenance issues don't become bigger issues that then cost more, you need to be maintaining them all year round. So we have maintenance crews on every single site that deal with those maintenance issues, and those maintenance issues are logged by students themselves on the portal, and our maintenance team will deal with it both at a site level, and then we have roving regional maintenance teams that support that site when it comes to more technical issues.
What is approximately the percentage of these costs of the
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
the percentage of the cost of the maintenance cost?
It varies hugely depending on the age of the facility. So, and again, it depends on how you manage it. If you're doing a preventive maintenance program where you're dealing with it, pretty much daily, then you can keep those costs down. Now, in our game, our cleaning staff that goes in, we clean every single room every week. That means every surface. Obviously, we clean the facility daily, and in certain cases, a few times a day. But when it comes to the student's bedroom, we provide a free weekly cleaning service. That provides us the opportunity to actually see that space. If there are any issues that need to be remedied, we deal with it that week that it's identified. Which means that A, the maintenance team gets on top of it, but secondly, when it comes to the rental and the deposit we hold with students, we're able to appropriate it and deal with it then, not at the end of the month or even at the end of the year, as is typically the case.
Hi, my name is Noah from Lusaka, Zambia. I just want to find out one thing. What sort of numbers are you seeing in terms of income versus expenses? And what's your establishment? You spoke of maintenance crews going around. I just want to have a feel of the kind of numbers you're running.
If I can, the first part I heard is you were asking what type of ratios do we see in terms of income versus expenditure?
Correct.
And the second question?
It's your establishment, the number of people that you employ.
The number of staff that we have on site.
Staff, yeah, sure.
And again, I think as I said earlier, your expense ratio is more a function of what your rental revenue is, because your fixed costs are pretty fixed. If we are charging a 3,000 Rand rental versus if you're charging a 7,000 Rand rental, our ops costs are fairly standard. So the ratio will be high for the lower rental bed, and obviously lower for the higher rental bed. In our case, we've adopted an airline model, where most of our facilities is a spread of product, a spread of affordability. So we will have a mix of product at a rental range. It ranges literally from the double non-ensuite right through to the ensuite single. And we look at a through rate, what's our average rental rate across all of those, which means that a higher rental bed, to an extent, is subsidizing the lower rental bed. And we believe that allows us to access a far deeper market, rather than simply being restricted to either the top end or the lower end. All in, if you're offering a true PBSA offering with all the amenities and the bells and whistles, including the full Res Life offering, I think it's very difficult to do on a through rate at less than a 37 to 40% ops cost ratio. So, in other words, you're going to be far more sensitive to vacancies than you would be if you were in an industrial building that's running on a 10-12% ops cost ratio. Your second question then was, sorry, what was the second question? Oh, staff. It's a function of the size of the facility. So we have our smallest facility is 300 beds, our largest is 2,300, and we have a few facilities that are roughly 1,100 round about there. I think our lowest staff complement is about 14 staff on a site, right up to 42 in the case of Hatfield Square. And that includes security and cleaning staff, administrative staff, collections, res managers, and maintenance.
I just wanted to get an understanding of when you talked about the developer and operator arrangements that you can get into. Are you seeking operator status at some point? Do you see yourself going outside of South Africa with that type of model, or are you going to focus only on developer operator at all times?
So currently in South Africa, we are developer, owner, operator. We have ventured outside of South Africa with our partners Redefine, and we're busy at the moment in Australia in a capacity as an operator, where we're providing support on the operational side of our systems. And we're busy in a few other jurisdictions overseas looking at opportunities and trying to close transactions. And we will look at both equity participation in the properties themselves, but definitely as operator across any of the markets where we think we can add value. And that includes Africa.
How easy to find a victim defaulting student?
Students don't default, they're generally very well behaved.
If they do.
Again, it all goes down to how you manage that student population. I think any landlord in any business, and it's what I learned. I started in residential in Johannesburg in the city, in the Hillbrow Yeovil area. And what I learned there was that as a landlord, you had to have the technical and moral high ground at all times. If you gave your tenants an excuse as to why they could hold back rental, they would. And provided you had that technical and moral high ground, then generally the tenants behaved, and those that didn't, you were able to get rid of. The eviction and the Prevention of Illegal Eviction Act, as well as the Rental Housing Tribunal and all the other structures in South Africa, make it very difficult to evict non-paying tenants. In our case, we are not typical residential. We do not have a rental agreement. We actually have a tenancy agreement, and that takes on quite a different course when it gets interpreted in law. But we have been fortunate that we haven't actually been pushed at all in terms of the regulations. We run a very tight outfit as to how students access our facility when they haven't paid, because everything is biometric access. So if you haven't paid, then you need to enter the building in a different way, which is not necessarily the convenience of a fingerprint. And that allows you to engage with that student and do some debt counselling. There are also other services that you may be not entitled to if the rent is outstanding. And some of those services are critical to students, and they're not lights and water. Okay? So thanks, guys.